You know, if we weren't roommates, I'd probably have already kissed you by now. Ethan's words hung in the air like smoke, intoxicating and impossible to ignore. He smirked from across the kitchen, his dark eyes gleaming with a mix of mischief and something else I couldn't quite place. My stomach flipped, and I laughed nervously, pretending not to take him seriously. Good thing we are roommates, then, I shot back, hoping my tone sounded casual. But my heart was hammering in my chest, and the butterflies Ethan stirred refused to settle. Ethan was the kind of guy who turned heads without even trying, effortlessly confident, broad-shouldered, and with a smile that felt like a secret he was daring you to uncover. When we'd first agreed to move in together 6 months ago, I was relieved to find he was easygoing and fun, making life in our small apartment feel light and uncomplicated. But lately things felt different. I glanced at the clock. My boyfriend, Nick, would be calling soon. Nick was steady and dependable, the perfect partner on paper. We'd been together for 2 years, and I knew he wanted us to take the next step, move in, start planning a future together. But lately, his messages felt routine, his laughter less infectious. It wasn't him, it was me. And then there was Ethan. It started innocently enough. Late-night movies on the couch when I couldn't sleep. Cooking dinner together and debating over whether chili should have beans. Sharing playlists and laughing over inside jokes that no one else would understand. He had a way of making me feel seen, like he noticed every detail and filed it away for safekeeping. I'm just saying, Ethan continued, leaning against the counter with a crooked grin, life's too short to play it safe all the time. His words pierced through me like an arrow. What's that supposed to mean? I asked, keeping my voice even as I leaned over to grab a coffee mug. Nothing, he said, shrugging as though the weight of his statement didn't matter. But his gaze lingered on me for just a moment too long. Forget I said anything. The tension between us was subtle, like a song playing in the background that you couldn't quite make out but still felt in your bones. I told myself it was nothing, that Ethan's teasing was harmless and I was overthinking. After all, Nick was who I loved, wasn't he? That night, I tried to shake the moment from my mind as I video called Nick. He smiled at me through the screen, but his expression felt distant, like a photograph instead of a memory. How's everything with Ethan? Nick asked casually. Fine, I said, maybe too quickly. We get along great. Good, Nick replied, distracted as he glanced at something off-screen. I'm glad you're not lonely. The irony of his words struck me like a slap. Lonely? With Ethan around, loneliness was the last thing I felt. If anything, I was drowning in emotions I didn't want to admit to myself. The next morning, Ethan and I passed each other in the hallway. He was heading to the gym, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Hey, you good? He asked, his tone softer than usual. Yeah, why? I replied, feigning indifference. You seemed distracted last night. I hope it's not something I said. I shook my head quickly. No, it's not that. I'm fine, really. He nodded, but the way his eyes searched mine made me feel like he saw right through my lie. As the days passed, the line between friendly banter and something deeper began to blur. Ethan had a way of making simple moments feel charged. When he laughed, it was impossible not to join in. When he touched my shoulder, even casually, it sent a ripple of heat through me. One evening, as we stood side by side washing dishes after dinner, his arm brushed against mine. The contact was fleeting, but it was enough to send my mind spiraling. You've got soap on your cheek, he said, his voice low as he reached out to wipe it away with his thumb. I froze, the world narrowing to the space between us. His hand lingered for a second, maybe two, before he stepped back, clearing his throat. Sorry, he said, his tone awkward for the first time since I'd met him. It's fine, I mumbled, but the air between us crackled with something unspoken. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. Ethan was right. Life was too short to play it safe. But crossing that line? It could change everything. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for that, or if I could stop myself. Why do you keep running from this? Ethan's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said. I froze in the doorway of the living room, caught between the safety of retreating to my bedroom and the dangerous pull of his words. The light from the TV flickered across Ethan's face, softening the sharp angles of his jaw but doing nothing to mask the intensity in his eyes. "I'm not running," I replied, my voice tight. "There's nothing to run from." Ethan scoffed, leaning forward on the couch, his elbows resting on his knees. "You really believe that? Because I don't." I could feel the heat rising in my chest, a mix of frustration and something deeper, something I didn't want to name. "Ethan, I have a boyfriend." He nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture that felt more like a challenge than an acknowledgement. "Yeah. You do. But that doesn't change what's happening here." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to walk away, to shut the door on this moment before it spiraled out of control. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Ethan stood and crossed the room in a few strides, stopping just a foot away from me. The closeness was suffocating, intoxicating. "Tell me you don't feel it," he said, his voice low and steady. "Look me in the eye and tell me this, whatever this is, doesn't mean anything." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. How could I deny what had been building between us? The stolen glances, the lingering touches, the way my heart raced every time he smiled. Instead of answering, I looked away, my silence betraying me. Ethan reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was electric, sending a jolt up my arm. "I see the way you look at me, Alex. You're not imagining this, and neither am I." I should have pulled away. I should have reminded him, and myself, that this was wrong. But instead, I stood there, frozen in the gravity of his presence. "You don't understand," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Nick, he's a good guy. He doesn't deserve." "This isn't about Nick," Ethan interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "This is about us. About what you want. And you can't keep pretending you don't want this." The dam broke. The walls I'd built to keep Ethan at arm's length crumbled in an instant. Before I could second-guess myself, I closed the distance between us, my lips crashing into his. The kiss was everything and nothing like I'd imagined. It was raw, desperate, and filled with the kind of hunger that came from months of restraint. Ethan's hands found my waist, pulling me closer as the world around us faded away. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads pressed together. "This is crazy," I murmured, my voice trembling. "Maybe," Ethan replied, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "But it feels right." We stood there for what felt like an eternity, caught in the fragile stillness of the moment. Part of me wanted to run, to undo what had just happened. But a stronger part, the part I'd been trying to silence, wanted more. Ethan took my hand, his touch gentle but insistent. "Come here." He led me to the couch, and we sank into the cushions, the tension between us palpable. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to stop thinking, to stop worrying about consequences and let myself feel. As the night unfolded, the line between us disappeared entirely. Every touch, every whispered word, felt like peeling back another layer of myself I hadn't realized existed. But as the hours passed, the reality of what we'd done began to creep in. When Ethan fell asleep, his arm draped possessively over my waist, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice. A choice that would change everything. I slipped out of his embrace and tiptoed back to my room, my heart heavy with guilt and a strange, unfamiliar exhilaration. Lying in my bed, I knew there was no going back to the way things were. The question was, what now? The silence between us the next morning was deafening. Ethan stood by the counter, sipping his coffee, his gaze flicking toward me every few seconds as if waiting for me to say something. I avoided his eyes, focusing instead on the steam rising from my own cup. "Alex," he said finally, breaking the tension. His voice was soft but carried an undeniable weight. I didn't look up. "We don't need to talk about it." Yes, we do. Ethan set his mug down and took a step closer. You can't just pretend nothing happened. I'm not pretending. I forced myself to meet his eyes, my chest tightening at the vulnerability I saw there. But we can't. This can't happen again. It was a mistake. Ethan's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to argue. But instead, he nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. If that's how you feel. The words stung more than I expected. I wanted him to fight for me, to convince me that what we had wasn't just a fleeting moment of weakness. But deep down, I knew the truth. No matter how much I wanted Ethan, I couldn't erase Nick from the equation. My stomach churned at the thought of him. I'd avoided his calls the night before, too consumed by what had happened with Ethan to even think about pretending everything was normal. But now, as I stood in the quiet of the kitchen, the weight of my betrayal pressed down on me like a stone. I need to clear my head, I said abruptly, grabbing my jacket from the back of a chair. Ethan didn't stop me. He just watched as I walked out the door. The park was nearly empty, the early morning chill keeping most people indoors. I wandered aimlessly, my thoughts a whirlwind of guilt, confusion, and longing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face, his smile, the way his hands had felt against my skin, the way he'd looked at me like I was the only person in the world. But then I thought of Nick. The way he'd always been there for me, steady and reliable, even when I didn't deserve it. He wasn't perfect, our relationship wasn't perfect, but he loved me. And I loved him, didn't I? The question echoed in my mind, relentless and unforgiving. By the time I returned to the apartment, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting golden light through the windows. Ethan was still in the kitchen, a book open in front of him, though he didn't seem to be reading it. He looked up when I walked in, his expression cautious. "Are you okay?" he asked. "No," I admitted, sinking into the chair across from him. "I'm not." Ethan closed the book and leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Talk to me, Alex. Please." I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. But then I realized that if I couldn't be honest with Ethan, someone who already knew the worst of me, who could I be honest with? "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I feel like I'm being pulled in two different directions, and no matter what I choose, I'm going to hurt someone." Ethan reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. "What do you want?" "I don't know," I whispered, though it wasn't entirely true. Part of me did know. Part of me wanted him. But admitting that felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready for. "Whatever you decide," Ethan said, his voice steady, "just be sure it's what you want. Not what you think you're supposed to want. You deserve to be happy, Alex." His words stayed with me long after he'd gone to his room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That evening, I called Nick. The sound of his voice brought a lump to my throat, and I had to fight to keep my composure. "Hey," he said, his tone warm but slightly distracted. "I've missed you." "I missed you too," I replied, the words catching in my throat. And in that moment, I realized they weren't entirely true. We talked for a while about his day, about plans for the weekend, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was lying to him with every word. When we finally said goodbye, I felt hollow. As I set my phone down, I glanced toward Ethan's closed door. The line between right and wrong had never felt so blurred. For now, the choice was still mine. But how long could I keep living like this, torn between what was safe and what made me feel alive? The answer was a clock ticking louder with every passing second.